The Cascade Range in November 1873. Mountains so vast they swallow sound. Snow so deep it...
22 years old. A bad hip. Half a sling of firewood. No horse. The wind shifts. The first flakes come down fat and slow.
Her family didn't get lost. They left on purpose. 22 years old, alone in a mountain pass with a bad hip, no horse, and a blizzard 3 hours out. Nell Whitmore stood in the snow and watched the wagon tracks move away from her. Not slow, not hesitating, fast. The kind of fast that means someone made a decision and didn't want to be talked out of it. They sent her for Firewood. They knew she'd be slow. They planned it. If you've ever been thrown away by the people who were supposed to love you most, this story is for you. Stay until the end. The storm came in the way the worst ones always do in the Cascade Range. Not gradually, not with much warning. Just a hard shift in the wind and then the sky going the color of dirty iron from one horizon to the other. Nell felt it before she saw it. She'd been moving through the tree line for maybe 20 minutes, breaking dead branches from the lower boughs of a cluster of Douglas firs, stuffing them into the canvas sling she carried over one shoulder. The cold had already worked its way through her wool coat and into the muscles along her left side, which always stiffened first. The hip that had never healed right after the wagon accident 2 summers back, the one her stepmother called her bad side, the same way you'd refer to a broken tool, had started to drag and ache the way it did when weather changed. She stopped, looked up through the branches. The light was wrong. Too dim for mid-afternoon and yellowing at the edges, which meant precipitation. Nell had grown up watching weather move across open country, had learned to read it the way other girls learned to read scripture. That sky meant snow, and not the gentle kind. That sky meant get inside. She turned around and started back toward the wagon. The canvas sling was only half full, maybe 20 pounds of wood. Not nearly enough for a night this cold. Certainly not enough for what that sky was promising. Her stepmother Harriet had been explicit that morning. Fill it completely. Don't come back with less than a full load. We can't afford to waste a stop. Nell had learned not to argue with Harriet about firewood, or about much of anything. She moved as quickly as her hip allowed, which wasn't very. The ground was uneven here, rocky beneath a thin skin of old snow, and every 4th or 5th step the bad leg wanted to give. She used a stick she'd picked up earlier as a walking staff, jabbing it into the frozen ground to stabilize herself, moving in the lurching asymmetrical rhythm she'd long since stopped being embarrassed about. Embarrassment was a luxury. Getting back to camp was a necessity. She emerged from the tree line into the clearing where they'd stopped, the clearing where the wagon had been. The wagon wasn't there. For a moment Nell just stood and looked at the empty space the way you look at something that doesn't make sense yet. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 60 feet across, with dead grass pressed flat by early frost. There were ruts in the ground where the wheels had sat. There was a shallow depression where their mule had stood for most of the morning. There were boot prints, many of them. Harriet's narrow heel, Birch's wide, heavy tread at 17, Ledger's smaller prints running in loops the way 13-year-olds run when they think no one is watching, and there was a single set of smaller prints, her own, leading away from the camp and into the trees. The wagon was not there. She walked to the center of the clearing. The ruts in the ground told the story plainly enough once she made herself look at them. The wagon had turned. The tracks showed the mule backing and repositioning, and then it had moved east further into the pass, not back the way they'd come. She stood there holding her half-full sling of firewood and looked at those tracks moving away from her. She told herself there was an explanation. Maybe the storm had spooked the mule. Maybe something had happened further ahead and her father had needed to push forward to find shelter. Maybe Birch had gotten hurt and they'd had to move fast. She told herself all of this while her eyes moved slowly over the tracks on the ground. The thing about tracks in soft snow and frozen mud is that they don't lie. They show you speed, they show you direction, they show you intention. And those tracks, her family's tracks, her father's wagon, everything she owned in the world, those tracks were moving away from her at a pace that wasn't panicked. The wheel furrows were deep and even. The gait of the mule's hooves was controlled. They had walked away from her deliberately. At a measured pace, Nell sat down in the snow. She didn't cry, not yet. She sat on the frozen ground in the middle of that empty clearing and looked at the tracks leading east, and for a long time she didn't do anything at all. The wind picked up. The first few flakes began to come down, fat and lazy, the kind that meant more behind them. And then it came back to her, the thing she had spent 3 weeks trying not to remember. It was a night in mid-October, 3 weeks before they'd started through the pass. The wagon had been stopped at the edge of a creek crossing, and Nell had been half asleep in the back, wrapped in blankets, the canvas cover muffling the world outside into something soft and distant. She hadn't been meant to hear it. Their voices carried on the still night air, and she'd surfaced from near sleep just enough to catch the words before she understood what they meant. Harriet's voice first. Low and certain, the way Harriet said everything she'd already decided. The girl can't make it through the pass, Cordon. Not with that leg. She'll slow us down and we'll all die trying to carry her. She is not your blood. She is a liability. You know it as well as I do. We have 3 children to think about. A long silence, whined in the grass, the mule shifting its weight. Then her father's voice, low and tired. I'll think about it. Nell had lain in the dark with her eyes open and her heart beating very fast and told herself she had misunderstood. The words were clear, but surely the meaning wasn't what it seemed. Harriet was harsh. Harriet had always been harsh. That didn't mean Corden would ever, that there were some things a person simply didn't do. She had spent 3 weeks convincing herself of this. She looked at the tracks in the snow. She had not misunderstood. The thing she understood now, sitting in that empty clearing with the storm coming in and the temperature dropping, was that she had known. Some part of her had known for 3 weeks and had chosen every single morning to load herself into that wagon anyway, because the alternative was to step off and stand alone on the open plain with nothing, and that had seemed impossible, so she had kept choosing to believe in something she already knew wasn't true. That, she thought, was the part that would take the longest to forgive herself for. Not them, herself. She thought about Birch, 17 years old, who had Harriet's jaw and her calculating eyes, who had watched Nell walk away toward the trees that morning with an expression she hadn't been able to read and now thought she could. He had known. She was almost certain of it. He had stood there and watched her go and said nothing, which meant he had made the same choice his mother made, just quieter about it. There was something particular about that silence. The kind that came from a person who had already decided which side of a line they were standing on and simply hadn't announced it yet. She thought about Ledger, 13, still young enough to be surprised by things, who had maybe not understood what was happening and maybe had. She thought about Harriet and the precise economy of her decisions. The way she looked at Nell's hip, the way you look at a broken axle. Something that had once been useful and now wasn't, and the only question remaining was how much longer you could afford to carry the weight of it. She thought about her father. Corden Whitmore was not a cruel man. She'd always told herself that. He was weak, maybe. The kind of man who went quiet when Harriet spoke and went along with whatever she decided because going along was easier than arguing. But not cruel. He had held Nell's hand when her mother died. He had sat with her through the long fever of that first winter without her. He had told her many times in his quiet way that she was the image of her mother and that he was grateful she was his. She looked at the small fire and thought about the silence after Harriet's words. I'll think about it. Not no, not never. Not over my dead body. I'll think about it. And he had thought about it, apparently, and arrived at a conclusion, and that conclusion was what the tracks in the snow had shown her. She sat there until the cold made sitting still dangerous, and then she stood up and took inventory. 1 wool coat, worn but intact. Boots that were good leather, slightly too big with wool stockings inside. A canvas sling that could serve as a bag. 20 pounds of firewood, which would last maybe 2 nights if she was careful. A flint striker in her left coat pocket. A small folding knife in her right, the one she'd carried since she was 14 and had never once thought she'd need for anything more serious than cutting rope. A tin cup she used for coffee at breakfast and had hung from her belt without thinking. No food except half a biscuit so hard it would crack a tooth and a small piece of dried venison she found at the bottom of her coat pocket, so forgotten she didn't know how long it had been there. No water except what she could melt from snow. No horse, no map. She looked east where the tracks went. East was the way through the pass. There might be a settlement at the other end. There might be trappers, travelers, a trading post, or there might not be. But east was the only direction that led somewhere other than deeper into the mountains, and she had no information about what lay to the north or south, and going back west meant retracing 2 days of hard travel with winter coming in behind her. East, then, in the morning. Tonight she needed to survive. She found a deadfall spruce at the edge of the tree line, its low-hanging branches weighted with old snow that formed a natural shelter against the wind. Getting there took most of what remained of the daylight, and by the time she'd crawled beneath the boughs with her bundle of firewood and her flint, her teeth were knocking together, and the hip had gone from aching to a deep, grinding wrongness she'd learned to breathe through when nothing else worked. She built a fire the size of both her fists pressed together, no larger. Fires make light and light can be seen, and she had no way of knowing who else moved through this pass in November. She ate the biscuit, nearly cracked a tooth on it, then the venison, chewing each piece slowly and carefully, making it last longer than it wanted to. It wasn't enough. It was nowhere near enough. She did not let herself cry because crying cost water and warmth, and she couldn't afford to spend either. She fed the last of the big pieces of wood into the fire and pulled her knees to her chest and waited for morning. She didn't sleep much. The cold wouldn't let her go deep enough. She kept surfacing to feed the fire or to shift position when the hip went from discomfort to something that felt almost like a scream. And each time she surfaced, she was aware of how dark it was and how far she was from anything human and how truly alone she had become. Not the temporary alone of stepping away from people who are waiting for you. The other kind. The kind where no one is waiting. In the morning, she followed the wagon tracks east. The tracks had been partially covered by new snow, but she could still make out the faint depression where the wheels had cut through. She followed it as best she could, moving slowly, stopping often to rest the hip, using the staff she'd kept from the night before. By midday, the snow was coming steadily, not the full blizzard she'd feared, but a persistent wet snow that settled into her collar and melted against her skin. Her coat was soaked through by noon. She was soaked through by early afternoon. By late afternoon, she wasn't sure she was still following the tracks or if she'd drifted. She stopped in a small clearing and tried to get her bearings. East was still east. The pass still had to have an end, but her body was giving up its heat in a way she'd heard described once by an old man who'd come through her father's trading post in Kansas years ago. He'd been speaking to the men around the fire, and Nell had been in the corner, pretending not to listen. "You stop shivering when you're really in trouble," he'd said. "Shivering is your body fighting. When it stops, you've run out of fight." She was still shivering. Barely. She started walking again. By the time the light was failing, she knew, with the clarity that comes when panic has exhausted itself and left behind something quieter and more honest, that she was not going to make it out of the mountains. The distance was too great. The cold was too deep. Her leg had gone from dragging to something closer to buckling with every third step. She'd fallen twice in the last hour. The second fall had taken several long minutes to recover from. The third fall, she thought, might be the last. She found a hollow between two large boulders out of the wind and sat down against the cold stone. She had no wood. Even if she'd had wood, she wasn't sure she had the fine motor control left to use the flint. Her fingers were past numb, past the place where she could feel them at all. She leaned her head back against the rock. The thought arrived with a kind of mild surprise, the way you note an interesting fact. I don't want to die. She was 22 years old. She had never been anywhere or done anything that was entirely her own choosing. She had lived inside other people's decisions her entire life. First her parents, then her stepmother's, and every morning she had climbed into a wagon headed somewhere she hadn't chosen, toward a life she hadn't designed, next to people who had ultimately decided she wasn't worth the weight she cost them. I don't want to die. The thought didn't lead anywhere useful. The mountain didn't care about what she wanted. The wind had died and the snow was falling straight down now, thick and fast, and it was settling on her coat and her hair and the tops of her boots. And she was aware that if she kept sitting here, the snow would simply cover her, and in the morning she would be a white shape that looked like a small boulder. She was aware of this and could not make herself move. Then the silence changed. Not a sound, exactly. More an absence of something, a shift in the texture of the stillness around her, the kind of change that the body registers before the mind catches up. She opened her eyes. There was a shape above her, large, standing between her and the snow-heavy sky. She had heard no footsteps, which meant the snow was deep enough to muffle them, which meant she had been sitting here longer than she'd thought. The shape resolved itself slowly into a man, very tall, wide across the shoulders in a way that wasn't fat but bulk, the kind that comes from years of physical labor in cold weather. He wore a heavy fur coat, the kind that was clearly made rather than bought, with the skins pieced together roughly but effectively. A hat of dark felt, pulled low. He had a rifle across his back and something dead hanging from his left hand. She couldn't make out what in the dim light. His face was half covered by a scarf wound twice around his lower jaw. He was looking at her. She looked back at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he crouched down, slowly, the way you'd crouch near something that might bolt, except she was far too frozen to bolt anywhere. She could see his eyes, dark, steady, moving over her the way a person's eyes move over something they're trying to understand. "You alive?" His voice was low, rough at the edges, like gravel underfoot. Yes, the word came out strange, thick. Her lips weren't working right. "You alone?" "Yes." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked up and around at the trees, at the clearing, at the snow falling thick and fast. Whatever he was calculating, he reached a conclusion about it. "Can you walk?" She tried to move her legs. The hip seized immediately and a sharp involuntary sound came out of her. Not quite a cry. More like a punctuation mark, the kind the body makes without asking permission. "No." He looked at her leg, then back at her face. Then, without saying anything else, he set down the thing he'd been carrying, a fox she saw now frozen stiff, and unslung the rifle and set that down too. He crouched and got one arm beneath her knees and one behind her back. "This will hurt," he said. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. It did hurt. The movement sent a white-hot flare up through her hip and spine that made her vision go briefly dark at the edges. She made that sound again, the involuntary one. He didn't stop, didn't apologize, just stood up with her, retrieved the rifle and the fox in a single efficient motion that suggested he'd carried things that didn't want to cooperate before, and started walking. "Where are you taking me?" "Cabin." "How far?" "Far enough." She wanted to ask more. "Who are you? What do you want? Is this better or worse than dying in the snow?" But the cold had taken most of her words, and the motion of being carried was jostling the hip into a steady, brutal ache that occupied most of her remaining attention. She watched the snow fall past the brim of his hat. She listened to his breathing, which was steady and controlled, the breathing of a man doing hard work who had done hard work before. The trees moved past. The world was white and gray and getting darker. She thought, "At least I'm not dying in the snow." And then she thought nothing at all for a while. She came back to herself by degrees. Warmth first. A deep animal warmth that she felt in her bones before she felt it on her skin. The kind of warmth you only fully understand after you've been truly, dangerously cold. Then smell, wood smoke and pine resin and something animal and something that might have been coffee or might have been boiled leather. Then sound, fire, the particular close sound of a fire in a stone hearth, the pop and shift of good burning wood. Then pain, her hip had settled into a deep volcanic throb. Her fingers and toes were doing something between tingling and burning as the blood came back to them, which she knew was good and felt terrible. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was rough-hewn timber close above her. She was lying on something, a cot or a pallet, covered with several heavy furs. The room was small enough that she could see most of it from where she lay. A stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, a rough table with 2 chairs. Shelves stacked with cans and dried goods and pelts and tools and things she couldn't identify in the low light. A single window covered with oilcloth, gray light pressing through from outside. A door, an iron stove with a pot on it, various things hanging from the ceiling beams, traps, dried herbs, a coil of rope, and a dog. It was sitting 3 feet from the cot, watching her with the steady, unblinking attention that belongs only to very large dogs and very old people. It was enormous, some kind of mix that included a considerable amount of something wolf-adjacent, pale gray fur, yellow eyes, an expression of complete neutrality that was somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. Nell and the dog looked at each other. "He won't bother you unless I tell him to." She turned her head. The man was at the fireplace, his back to her, doing something with a pot. He'd taken off the fur coat and the hat. His hair was dark with threads of gray and was longer than fashionable, pulled back roughly at the nape of his neck. Without the coat he was still large, broad-shouldered, long-armed. She could see scarring on the side of his neck that disappeared into his collar. "What's his name?" she said. Her voice was still thick. He glanced over his shoulder at the dog. "Flint." She looked at the dog. Flint's tail moved once, a single slow sweep, then stopped. "What's yours?" A pause, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Voss." "Just the one name?" "Garrett Voss." She looked back at the ceiling. "My name is Nell Whitmore." He brought a cup over and held it out. Some kind of broth. Barely anything, mostly hot water with a faint brownish tinge and a smell more functional than appealing. She tried to sit up and her hip reminded her that sitting up was not currently a casual act. He watched her struggle without offering to help. Then, when she'd gotten herself propped against the rough wall behind the cot, he held out the cup again. "Drink it slow." She took the cup in both hands. Her fingers were clumsy, not fully her own yet. The broth was thin and faintly salty and the most welcome thing she had tasted in as long as she could remember. She drank it slowly, as instructed. "Thank you." He had already turned back to the fire. She slept again. When she woke the second time, the light through the oilcloth was brighter, which meant morning, which meant she had lost most of a day somewhere. The fire had been stoked. Flint was no longer at her bedside, but she could hear him, a quiet shifting near the door. Garrett was at the table doing something with a length of wire and a small tool. Working on a trap, she realized. His hands moved with the economical precision of someone who had done the same task 10,000 times. She watched him for a minute before he registered she was awake. He was older than she'd first thought. Not old, but past 40, she guessed. Maybe well past it. The scarring on his neck was more visible now, and she could see there was more of it extending up behind his left ear. His face, when he turned slightly to reach for something on the table, was deeply weathered and unreadable in the way of men who had spent a great deal of time alone. Not unfriendly, just closed, the way a house is closed when no one has expected visitors. "How long was I out?" she said. He didn't look up from the trap. "Part of yesterday, all last night." She processed this. "What day is it?" "Thursday." He said it the way you'd state the temperature outside, a fact of limited relevance. She needed to use the facilities and said so in the most practical way she could manage. And he said the same thing he'd said about the hip, which was that she couldn't manage it alone and would fall on the steps. And she wanted to argue, and the hip's first movement when she shifted her weight argued on his behalf. He helped her to the door with the brusque efficiency of someone who had assisted injured animals before and found the process tedious but necessary. He gave her privacy. He helped her back. He didn't say anything about any of it, which she was grateful for, because there was nothing less dignified than needing help with the basics of existing, and she had very little dignity left to protect. When she was back on the cot, he went to the stove and came back with a bowl of beans with some dried meat mixed in. "Eat." She ate. Over the next 2 days, Nell pieced together what she could about Garrett Voss. He didn't offer information voluntarily. He didn't offer much of anything voluntarily. But she was conscious and observant and had spent most of her life in a household where she had to read between the lines of what people said and didn't say, and she watched him carefully. He was a trapper. That was clear from the pelts that hung everywhere and the traps in various states of maintenance and the smell of the place, which was heavily animal in a way she was slowly becoming accustomed to. He ran trap lines somewhere in the mountains above. She gathered this from the details of his comings and goings, what he prepared before going out, what he came back with. He was skilled. She could see it in the quality of the pelts, in the way he moved through the work with no wasted motion. He had lived alone here for a long time. The cabin had the quality of a space that had never been organized for more than one person. One chair angled toward the fire, one cup. One plate. Everything at a height and placement that worked for someone of his specific size and reach. No photographs she could see. No letters. No personal items that pointed to anyone or anywhere else. Just the work of surviving, done with the thoroughness of a man who had made it into a life. She learned on the second day that his right knee had been damaged at some point. He didn't limp, he'd adapted past limping, but she could see the way he placed his weight getting up from a crouch, the way he descended the porch steps with the right leg doing less of the work. It was old, an accommodation so ingrained he'd stopped knowing he was making it. She did not ask about the scar. On the third day, she tried to get up on her own to reach something on the shelf. She made it to standing, crossed the 6 feet to the shelf, and was reaching for the tin cup she'd been using when the hip simply quit mid-movement, and she went down hard. She caught herself on the edge of the shelf, which was not as well secured as it might have been, and the shelf and the cup and several other items came down with her in a clatter. She sat on the floor surrounded by the debris and waited for the pain to settle into something manageable. Garrett appeared in the doorway from outside, rifle in hand, taking in the scene. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the shelf and the scattered items. He looked back at her. "You're not fine. I'm sitting on the floor voluntarily. It's a meditation practice, very fashionable back east." He put the rifle against the wall. He collected the items from the floor, replaced the shelf, and secured it with 2 additional nails. He set the tin cup on the table. Then he held out his hand. She took it and he pulled her upright in a single smooth motion. "Don't do that again," he said. "Try to get my own cup? Fall." She understood what he meant. Not a scolding, a practical concern. He had invested time and effort in keeping her alive, and her falling on the floor was a threat to that investment. She wasn't a person to him yet. She was a responsibility he'd acquired. She sat back on the cot and thought about that. Then she thought about how he had walked 2 miles through a blizzard to find her in the dark. She thought about the Zo Chun she would notice the following morning, and didn't yet know the meaning of. On the 4th day, her hip was functional enough to move carefully around the cabin, and she had enough of herself back together to think about her situation with some clarity. She waited until evening when Garrett had come back from the trap line and was eating at the table. She'd been awake and restless all day, turning the question over. Now she sat down in the other chair, the one she'd noticed him glance at when she moved it, the way a person looks at something that has been in a certain place so long its position has become a fact. "I need to understand what this is," she said. He looked at her over his bowl. "What this is. This. Me being here. What you expect. What the terms are." He set down his spoon. "Terms? You found me. You brought me here. You've been feeding me. I assume that doesn't come without expectations." Something moved across his face. Not offense. More like recognition. "What kind of expectations are you worried about?" he said. "The obvious kind." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "No, you don't have them, or no, you won't act on them. No to both." He picked up his spoon again. "You're in no shape, and you can't get out of the mountains until spring. I'm not going to add to your trouble." She studied his face. He was still eating, which she thought meant he'd said what he meant and didn't feel the need to elaborate. "All right," she said. "Then what do you need from me? Because I can't just sit on that cot and eat your food and not contribute anything. I won't do that." He looked at her for a moment. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you mend?" "Yes." "Can you stay out of my way when I'm working?" "That depends on how much space you need." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the facial equivalent of someone making a note. "That's the deal then. You cook and mend and keep the fire. I hunt and run the lines and keep the cabin standing. In spring you leave." She nodded. "All right." He went back to eating. She watched him for a moment. Then she said it, not because she had planned to, because it had been sitting inside her chest for 4 days and needed somewhere to go. "My family left me." He didn't say anything. He also didn't look away, which she noticed. People usually looked away. "Not because they were lost," she said. "They made a choice. My stepmother decided I was a liability, a cost they couldn't carry through the pass, and my father decided she was right." Silence. "I heard them plan it," she said. 3 weeks before they did it, I heard every word, and I chose not to believe it. I kept climbing into that wagon every morning because I didn't know what else to do." She paused. Outside, the wind moved through the pass. "I'm not going to go after them," she said. "I'm not going to do anything foolish. I just needed to say it out loud to someone. I haven't yet." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Eat something." She blinked. He nodded toward the stove. "There's more in the pot. You haven't eaten enough today." It wasn't sympathy exactly. It was something more basic than sympathy. Something that simply said you are alive and that has to keep going. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that it was enough. She got up and got more food from the pot. Her hip held. She sat back down and ate. Outside, the storm had found them again, and the wind threw snow against the oilcloth window and made the fire lean in the hearth. But inside the fire held. The cabin was small and rough and smelled like traps and dog and wood smoke. She ate. She was still alive. For now, that was the whole of it. The first full week in the cabin nearly broke her in a different way than the cold had. Physical survival had its own logic. Keep warm, keep fed, keep moving. That she understood. What she hadn't anticipated was the particular difficulty of existing in close quarters with a man who communicated primarily through silence and expected you to figure out the rest on your own. Garrett Voss did not explain himself. He did not explain his routines, his expectations, his reasons for doing things in precisely the way he did them. He simply did them in the same order at roughly the same times. And if you were in the way, you learned quickly to not be in the way. He woke before light. She knew this because she'd surfaced from sleep to the sound of the fire being stoked and the soft click of Flint's nails on the floor as the dog followed him to the door. By the time gray light came through the oilcloth window, Garrett was already gone, out on the trap lines. He returned by mid-afternoon, sometimes earlier if the weather was bad, and he'd spend the remaining light working in the cabin or on the small porch, repairing equipment, processing whatever the traps had yielded, doing the 1,000 maintenance tasks that keeping a remote cabin functional apparently required. He ate twice a day. He spoke rarely. He moved through the cabin like a man who had spent so long alone that he'd stopped imagining he might need to accommodate another person's presence. Nell watched him and took note and started carefully to make herself useful. The first morning she was mobile enough to stand at the stove for any length of time. She made a proper breakfast. Not much because there wasn't much to work with, but she found cornmeal and salt and rendered fat, and she made hoe cakes on the iron griddle that had been sitting unused on the shelf. When Garrett came back from checking a nearby trap, she'd heard him moving around outside. He came in and stopped when he smelled something that wasn't broth. He looked at the plate she'd set on the table. He looked at her. "Sit," she said. "They're going to get cold." He sat. He ate 3 of them without saying anything. Then he said, "There's molasses in the tin on the second shelf. I saw it. I wasn't sure if you were saving it. Not for anything particular." She got the molasses. He poured some over the last hoe cake and ate it. She sat across from him with her own plate and ate and didn't try to make conversation, because she'd already learned that conversation with Garrett Voss was not something you could force into existence. It either happened or it didn't. That morning it didn't. But the plate was empty when he went back out. Every last hoe cake gone, and she decided to count that as the same thing as a compliment, because with a man like him, it probably was. She spent that morning taking inventory of the cabin's food stores in a systematic way, making mental notes because there was no paper she could find, and she didn't want to ask for any yet. What she found was not encouraging. Dried meat, mostly venison and some rabbit. Canned goods that were mostly beans and tomatoes. Cornmeal and a small amount of flour. Some dried apples that had gone leathery. Salt, which was more important than it sounded. Coffee, barely enough. Rendered fat. 1 small jar of honey instead of sugar. A little rice, a very little rice. She thought about the weeks of winter still ahead. She thought about 2 people eating instead of 1. She did the arithmetic in her head, and it didn't produce comfortable results. When Garrett came back that afternoon with 2 rabbits, she didn't say anything about the arithmetic. But that evening, when she made stew with one of the rabbits and stretched it further than it wanted to go with the beans, she made sure every piece of the animal was used and the bones went back into the pot for broth. He noticed. She could tell by the way he looked at the pot, then at her, with the calculating expression he got when he was adding something up. He didn't say anything, he ate. She was beginning to understand that with Garrett, eating what you made was the compliment. Everything else was just words. The harder adjustment was the physical space of the cabin itself. It was built for 1 person, and it accommodated 2 with the grudging tolerance of a coat that was 1 size too small. There was the cot she was sleeping on, which was his. She'd figured that out when she saw him making a pallet on the floor near the fire without any comment about it, and she'd immediately said he should take the cot back, and he'd said he slept better on the floor, and she'd known that was probably not true, but also known there was no argument to be had. They walked into each other 3 times in the first week. The first time she was crossing from the stove and he was moving to the shelf, and they met in the middle with a jar of salt between them, and she stepped back onto his foot. "Sorry," she said. He didn't say anything, just moved around her. The second time was worse. She'd been reaching for the water bucket, and he came in from outside suddenly, the door catching wind and swinging hard, and the surprise of it made her spin, and the bad hip gave its immediate opinion on spinning abruptly, and she went down on 1 knee with a sound she hated making. He was there before she'd finished going down, 1 hand gripping her upper arm, taking her weight. She steadied. He let go and stepped back, like touching her was something he'd done on instinct and wasn't sure about now. "I'm fine," she said, before he could look at the leg with that assessing expression. "You twisted it." "I didn't twist it, I stumbled." "It's different." It didn't sound different. She took a breath and stood up straight and looked at him levelly. He was maybe 3 feet away, and in the interior of the cabin he seemed even larger than he had in the snow, filling more of the room just by being in it. "I have a bad hip," she said. "It's not going to get better. It's just the way it is. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop monitoring it like it's about to become your problem." Something shifted in his expression, not irritation. More like he was revising something he'd assumed. "It's already my problem if you fall and can't work," he said. That was such a purely practical response that she almost laughed. "Fair point," she said. "I'll be more careful." She was more careful. She also started moving differently through the cabin, making wider turns, keeping 1 hand available to catch a shelf or the table edge, being conscious of where her feet were relative to everything else. It wasn't new, exactly. She'd been managing the hip her whole adult life, but she'd slipped into carelessness during the worst days in the snow, pushing through pain rather than working with it, and now she had to relearn the careful management of it. Garrett, for his part, started doing something she didn't notice for several days. He started rearranging things. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but she'd reach for a pot and find it had moved to the lower shelf, or she'd go to pull water and find the bucket had been relocated to a spot she could reach without the stretch that had caused the stumble. Small adjustments made without comment that made moving through the cabin slightly less of a negotiation with her own body. She thought about saying something about it. She decided not to. Acknowledgement might make him stop. The third collision was entirely her fault, and she knew it. She'd been mending his second coat. He had two, a heavier outer one for the worst cold and a lighter working coat for everything else. The lighter one had a long tear along the back seam that had been patched badly before and was pulling open again. She'd found a needle and thread in his kit and set to work, and she'd been so focused on the stitching that she hadn't heard him come back in from outside. When he put his hand on the coat to take it from the hook she was reaching for simultaneously, they were suddenly occupying about 6 inches of the same space. She felt the warmth of him before she registered he was there. He smelled like cold and pine and wood smoke and something else she couldn't name. She stepped back quickly, coat in hand, and he stepped back too, and there was a half-second where they were both recalibrating. "I was mending it," she said. "The back seam. It was going to go completely if it wasn't fixed." He looked at the coat in her hands, then at her. "You don't have to do that, I know, I wanted to." She paused. "The stitching that was there before was wrong for the stress on that seam. It'll hold better done differently." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you know about stitching seams? My mother was a seamstress." She turned the coat to show him where she'd already reworked the first 6 inches of the tier. "She taught me everything she knew. I'm probably the best seamstress within 50 miles of wherever we are right now." The corner of his mouth did the thing, the not-quite smile. "Probably," he said. She sat back down and continued mending. He moved around her to the stove. She listened to him pour coffee and thought about how that was the most she'd made him say in one stretch since the day they'd negotiated the arrangement. Small victories, she thought. You counted them when they came. The days settled into a rhythm that wasn't comfortable exactly, but was functional. Nell cooked, and she cooked well, which was perhaps the most useful thing about her in this situation. She had a talent for making limited ingredients produce more than they seemed to contain. She'd grown up doing it in the trading post kitchen when money was tight, which it usually was. She stretched the dried meat into soups, used the fat and the cornmeal and the dried apples in combinations that produced something more than the sum of their parts, rationed the coffee with the discipline of someone who understood it was not going to be replenished soon. She mended everything that needed mending. There was a great deal that needed mending. Garrett had been managing his clothing with the pragmatic approach of a man who patched things just enough to keep them functional and no further. Sleeves missing buttons. A pair of heavy wool trousers with a knee that had been darned so many times the darn itself was unraveling. Boot liners sewn back together with what appeared to be rawhide cord, which worked but was terrible for warmth. She worked through it systematically, and each morning when he dressed she could see him register, briefly and without expression, that something was different about how his clothing fit or held together. He didn't say thank you. She hadn't expected him to. She kept the fire going, which was more work than it sounded. Wood had to be brought in from the pile on the porch, and the pile had to be managed so the wettest pieces dried before they were needed. The fire had its own temperament depending on the wood and the wind and the draft in the chimney, and keeping it at the right level was part skill and part constant attention. She learned it. Flint helped in his odd, non-demonstrative way. The dog had decided sometime in the second week that Nell was an acceptable presence, and he expressed this by shifting his sleeping spot from near the door to somewhere between the door and the cot, which put him roughly in her orbit. He didn't invite petting exactly, but he didn't discourage it either, and she found herself talking to him in the afternoons when Garrett was out. Not saying anything particular, just talking, because the silence of the cabin alone was a different kind of silence than the silence when Garrett was in it, and she needed to hear a voice even if it was her own. One afternoon, in the middle of a one-sided conversation with Flint about what she imagined the mountains looked like in summer, the dog's head came up and swiveled toward the door, and then Garrett's boots hit the porch steps 2 minutes before she'd expected him. She stopped mid-sentence. Flint's tail moved once. Garrett came in, stamped snow from his boots, hung his coat. He glanced at Flint, then at Nell. "Talking to the dog," she said, before he could ask or not ask. "He won't answer. He's a good listener." Garrett hung his hat. "He listens when he wants to. Rest of the time he's thinking about rabbits." She looked at Flint, who had gone back to watching the door as though nothing had happened, which was its own kind of statement. "I don't blame him," she said. Something in the air shifted slightly when she said that. A fraction less weight. The closest thing to ease she'd felt in the 2 weeks since she'd arrived. She filed it away and didn't push it. The hard conversations happened slowly, in pieces. Nothing straight on, everything at an angle. She learned that he'd come to the mountains 11 years ago and hadn't been east of them since. She learned this not because he said it directly, but because of a reference he made to a particular winter she could place, and she counted back. She learned that he'd built the cabin himself, which explained its combination of solid construction and rough finishing. The bones were good, and the details were an afterthought. She learned that Flint was 6 years old, which she'd already guessed from the gray around his muzzle, and that there had been a dog before him, which Garrett mentioned once and then didn't mention again. And she understood from the way he said it that the previous dog's death was the kind of loss that doesn't get smaller with time. She didn't push for more than what came voluntarily. She'd learned early that pushing with Garrett produced not more information but less. He'd go quieter and pull further back, and whatever door had been opening would go back to being a wall. What she gave him in return for his unwilling patience was competence. Every meal that was better than what he'd have managed alone. Every piece of clothing that came back functional rather than just patched. Every evening when the fire was at the right level and the water was already boiled when he came in cold and tired. That was what she had to offer, and she offered it without comment or expectation. One evening near the end of the second week, she was mending a pair of thick wool socks, both heels worn through simultaneously, which seemed like a particular achievement, and Garrett was at the table with a piece of leather and a small awl working on the strap of a snowshoe. The fire was good. Outside, the wind had settled for the first time in days to a low background murmur rather than the howling that had been making the oilcloth windows bow. She said, without looking up from the sock, "Do you ever miss it? Back east?" He didn't answer immediately. She waited. "Some things," he said. "Like what?" A pause. The awl made small, precise sounds in the leather. "Better coffee," he said finally. She snorted. She hadn't meant to. It came out before she could stop it. And then she was laughing, which she also hadn't done in what felt like a very long time. The laugh sounded strange in the low-ceilinged cabin. Too big for the room and rusty from disuse. He looked at her, not quite smiling, watching. "Sorry," she said, getting herself back under control. "That wasn't what I was expecting. What were you expecting?" "I don't know. A person, a place, something significant." "Coffee significant," he said, "when it's good." She went back to the sock. She was smiling, and she let herself because he wasn't looking at her anymore. "Fair enough," she said. The fire settled. Flint exhaled from somewhere near the hearth. Outside, the mountain held itself in a silence that was almost peaceful. And inside the small, rough cabin, two people sat in their respective silences, not close and not far, and the evening passed in a way that was not friendship yet, but was perhaps the raw material of it. Then came the evenings she found the dress. She'd been looking for an extra needle. She'd been through the main kit and thought there might be a secondary one somewhere on the lower shelves, the kind of thing a person accumulated in odd places over years of solitary living. She was working methodically along the shelf nearest the far wall when her hand found a wooden box she'd assumed held more tools. She opened it. Inside, folded with a care that was different from the careful but true practicality of everything else in the cabin, was a dress. Deep blue wool, well made, with small buttons down the front that had been polished recently enough to still hold their shine. Beneath it, a pair of women's gloves in brown leather, soft and small, folded together. And beneath those, a photograph, small and slightly faded, the kind taken in a proper studio, of a woman sitting very straight in a chair with her hands in her lap and an expression that was trying not to smile and mostly failing. Nell stood very still. She put the photograph back. She put the gloves back. She refolded the dress exactly as she'd found it and closed the box and replaced it on the shelf. Then she went back to the table and sat down and picked up her mending. Garrett came back an hour later. He hung his coat and hat and went to the stove and poured what was left of the afternoon's coffee. He stood at the stove with his back to her for a long moment. She said nothing. She kept her eyes on the mending. Then he said, without turning around, her name was Ada. Nell set down the needle. "She came with me when I built this place," he said. 11 winters ago. She wanted to. That was important to me, that it was her choice, too. He was quiet for a moment. Third winter, she got sick. Not dramatically. Just the kind of sick that builds slowly when the cold is bad and there's not enough of certain things. By the time I understood how serious it was, the pass was closed. I couldn't get her out. The fire made its small sounds in the hearth. I waited 2 days thinking the weather would break, he said. It didn't. She died on the 4th day. Nell didn't say she was sorry. She'd found in her own experience with loss that sorry was often the least useful thing one person could offer another. Instead, she said, "She looks like someone who laughed easily." From the photograph, he turned then and looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not pain exactly. Something older than pain. Something that had been sitting with itself for 11 years and had found, maybe, a new way to be looked at. "She did," he said. "She laughed at almost everything." Another silence. "That's why I came out into the storm for you," he said. His voice was even, but it cost him something to say it. She could hear the cost of it underneath the evenness. "I have spent 11 years telling myself that if I had moved faster, if I had gone for help sooner instead of waiting for the weather to decide for me, she might have lived. I don't know if that's true, but I know that when I saw your tracks in the snow going the wrong direction, I was not going to be the man who waited again." Nell held that for a moment. She thought about the morning after she'd woken in the cabin, when she'd looked through the gap in the oilcloth and seen the snow outside and noticed, in the pale early light, 2 sets of tracks leading away from the cabin toward where she'd been found. Not 1 set, 2. His boots in Flint's paws, going out, not coming in. He hadn't stumbled across her. He had gone looking. She hadn't asked about it then because she hadn't known what to do with the answer. Now she did. "Thank you for not waiting," she said quietly. He nodded once. He took his coffee to the table and sat down and picked up the snowshoe strap he'd been working on, and they spent the rest of the evening in a silence that was different from all the silences that had come before it. Not empty, not the silence of 2 strangers coexisting. Something more like the silence of 2 people who have shown each other a wound and decided to keep working anyway. 3 days later, in the gray middle of January, Flint went rigid at the door. It wasn't his alert but casual posture. It was the full-body stillness of an animal that had identified something specific. His head was up, his gaze fixed on the tree line to the south, and a low sound started in his chest that Nell had never heard from him before. She was at the stove. She stopped. Garrett was on the porch checking a piece of equipment and came in immediately, reading the dog without needing to be told. He took the rifle from the wall and stood to the side of the window and lifted the corner of the oilcloth an inch. "Someone's coming," he said. "How many?" "1." Moving slow. They waited. After several minutes there was a sound that was technically a knock, except it was tentative in a way that a stranger wouldn't be tentative, more like someone who wasn't sure of their welcome but had convinced himself he had a right to stand there. Nell knew that knock. She crossed to the door before Garrett could and opened it. Birch Whitmore was 17 years old and looked younger than that, standing in the snow with ice in his eyebrows and his coat not heavy enough for the weather. He was taller than she'd remembered, or maybe that was the cold making him hunch differently. And he had Harriet's jaw and her calculating eyes, the eyes that were always adding something up. Nell had known him his whole life. She had taught him to play cards when he was 9 years old, sitting on the porch of her father's trading post on long summer afternoons. She had once sat up with him through a fever night when he was 11, pressing cold cloths to his forehead and telling him stories until he fell asleep, and she had thought in that long, tired night that perhaps there was more to him than Harriet had managed to put there yet. Looking at him now, she was no longer sure of that. He looked at her, and something crossed his expression that she couldn't entirely read and chose not to try to. "You're alive," he said. "I am." She didn't step back to let him in. She stood in the doorway and waited. He looked past her into the cabin briefly. At the fire, at the shelves, at the table with its 2 plates, 2 cups, the evidence of a life being lived in this space. His eyes moved the way she'd seen Harriet's eyes move over a room, taking inventory, calculating, filing things away for later. "Mother wanted to know," he said, "if you made it through." Nell looked at him steadily. "She wanted to know," Nell said, "or she wanted to be certain." He didn't answer that. He looked at his boots for a moment, then back at her. "Are you coming back?" he said. "With the wagon train in spring?" "No," she said. He nodded very slightly, as though this confirmed something he'd already expected. Garrett appeared at Nell's shoulder then. He said nothing. He simply stood there, and the fact of him, the height and the stillness and the rifle held loosely at his side, occupied the doorway in a way that made the conversation feel finished without anyone having to declare it so. Birch looked at Garrett, then at Nell. Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a different kind of understanding, one he hadn't brought with him on the trail up. Then he turned and walked back into the snow, and neither of them said anything as he went. Nell watched until he disappeared into the tree line. Then she closed the door. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment. "She wanted to know if I was still alive," she said quietly. Not because she was concerned. Because if I'm alive and I make it out in spring, I'm a complication she hadn't finished dealing with. Garrett set the rifle back on the wall. He said nothing. She was glad of the silence. She didn't want words about it right now. She wanted to stand for a minute with the understanding of what she'd just seen in Birch's face. And then she wanted to set it somewhere she could carry it without it weighing too much. And then she wanted to get back to work. She went back to the stove. She made dinner. They ate. Outside the temperature dropped and the wind came back, and Birch Whitmore was out there somewhere making his way back to whatever camp Harriet had established for the winter, carrying his report. Nell found she had nothing left to feel about it except a clean and rather quiet anger, and underneath that, something that surprised her. Clarity. They had sent him to check if she was still a problem. She intended to remain one. The wolf pack found them in late January. Nell saw the first one at the tree line on a Tuesday morning, gray and thin in a way that meant real hunger. Not the lean health of a wolf in good country, but the gaunt angularity of an animal that had been moving through bad terrain in a bad winter with not enough to eat. It was watching the cabin with the focused, patient attention of something that had been watching longer than they knew. By that afternoon, she'd counted 5. "They've been following the cabin smell," Garrett said, standing at the window beside her. "The cold carries scent differently than people expect. We've been burning the bones in the stove, but 5 animals that hungry, they can work out a great deal from small signals. What do? They wait. Then they test. For how long? Until the math changes. Either they find something easier or they get desperate enough that we stop looking like a risk." She looked at the 5 shapes at the edge of the clearing. They were terribly thin. She understood their hunger as a practical fact without finding it less dangerous. "We have to solve two problems," she said, "the food and the wolves." He looked at her sideways. "If we solve one," she said, "we solve both." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, which she had learned was the equivalent of a longer agreement from anyone else. They came in the early morning 2 days later. Nell heard them before she saw them, a series of short, high vocalizations that moved through the trees and came from more than one direction. Flint was already at the door, rigid and silent, which was more serious than growling. She woke Garrett with a hand on his shoulder, and he was on his feet before she'd finished the motion. They went to the window together. The lead wolf was in the clearing, alone in front, the others spread behind it in the tree line. It was looking directly at the cabin with the calm, measuring look of something that had made a decision. She could see how thin it was, how desperate. "I'll go out," he said. She was already at the door. "Together," she said. "Like last time." There was no last time that was like this, he started to say. She opened the door. The cold hit like a wall. She stepped onto the porch and pulled herself up to her full height, which was not particularly impressive in absolute terms, but was everything she had. And when the lead wolf's gaze shifted to her, she met it directly and made a sound that surprised her. A shout. Not words, just sound, loud and sharp and as aggressive as she could make it. The sound of something larger than she was. The sound of something that was not prey. The wolf checked, startled, pulled back 2 steps. Behind her she heard Garrett step onto the porch. They held the porch through the rest of the morning, spelling each other in turns, keeping a presence visible. The wolves circled but didn't commit. By late afternoon they had pulled back to the deeper tree line. In the morning first light, Garrett took the lead wolf with a single shot from the window. The others broke and were gone before the echo finished returning from the mountains. They went out together to deal with what the shot had left behind. And neither of them talked much while they did the work, because there was a specific weight to killing something out of necessity that didn't ask to be made comfortable with conversation. She felt it and she thought he felt it, and she respected that he didn't try to talk it away. The wolf pack didn't come back after that. What they left behind in the clearing, the specific arithmetic of necessity, was something neither of them discussed further. They had done what the situation required. That was the whole of it. The meat was lean and strongly flavored and not particularly good, and they both ate it without complaint, because it was the difference between the numbers working and not working, and both of them were past the point of needing food to be pleasant. It was in February that the branch came down. Garrett had been checking the north line, which ran further from the cabin than the others, and required crossing a section of timber that had taken heavy snow load all winter. She'd heard the wind pick up that morning and watched the sky and thought about saying something and decided against it, because he had been running these lines for 11 years and knew the risks better than she could tell him. He came back in the failing light, and she knew before he reached the porch steps. He was moving wrong. Listing, his right leg tracking differently with every step, not the old accommodation of the damaged knee, but something new and immediate. And when the porch light reached his face, she could see it was tight with something that had gone past cold into a different register of pain entirely. His lower leg was dark, not wet dark from snow. Dark, dark, the dark of blood that had soaked through wool and been out in the cold long enough to begin to freeze there. "Sit down," she said. "It's not as bad as sit down, Garrett." Something in her voice made him sit. She heard it herself as she said it and recognized it as something she hadn't used before, a frequency that didn't ask. She got her knife and cut the trouser leg rather than trying to roll it, because the wool had frozen stiff with blood and there wasn't time for careful. She peeled it back and looked at what was underneath, and her stomach registered an opinion that she set aside. A broken branch, jagged the way dead wood breaks when heavy snow load brings it down without warning, had torn through the flesh of his lower leg, lateral side, 5 inches above the ankle. The wound was 4 inches long and deep, shallower at the edges where the bark had skidded, deeper in the center. It had bled considerably. It was still bleeding slowly, and he'd been in the cold long enough that the blood had frozen in layers over the wound rather than clotting cleanly. "When did this happen?" she said. 2 hours ago, maybe more. You walked on this for 2 hours. Didn't have another option." She looked up at him. His face was very controlled, which meant it was costing him something considerable to keep it that way. There was a white edge around his mouth she recognized from watching other people manage serious pain. "I have to clean it," she said, "and close it. I know, I need the whiskey. Shelf above the door, behind the I'll find it." She stood. "Don't move." The whiskey was where he'd started to tell her, more than half full, which was fortunate. She found the needle and heavier thread from the kit, put water on to boil, tore the cleanest rags she could find into strips, and brought everything back to where he was sitting. She pulled the other chair in front of his and sat and looked at the wound again, up close and in the firelight. She did not allow herself to look at it the way fear would look at it. She looked at it the way her mother had taught her to look at difficult fabric, as a problem with a solution, as something to be worked with rather than reacted to. "This is going to hurt," she said, "a lot. I know that too. Hold the chair." She cleaned the wound with the whiskey, pressing the cloth directly to it, and he made a sound that was almost nothing, almost completely suppressed. But she felt the muscles of his leg go rigid under her hands, and she pressed harder rather than lighter, because stopping partway was worse than going quickly through. "Talk," he said through his teeth. "What? Talk. Say something. Anything." She pressed the cloth and held pressure and talked. She didn't know what she said exactly. Something about the cornmeal and how she'd been managing the supply and whether the ratio of fat to meal made a difference in how the hoe cakes held together and what she'd do differently when they had better provisions. She kept her voice level while her hands did what they needed to do, and he held the back of the chair with both hands and breathed. And Flint pressed himself against Garrett's left leg and leaned there with the steadiness of a dog who understood something was wrong and had made a decision about what to do about it. "I have to stitch it," she said when she had it as clean as she could get it. "I figured. I've done it before, not on a wound this size. But I know what I'm doing." He looked at her. In the firelight, his face was open in a way she hadn't seen before, like the pain had taken down something he usually kept carefully maintained. "I believe you," he said. She hadn't expected that. She almost asked him to repeat it. Instead, she threaded the needle and started. She worked the way her mother had taught her to work on difficult fabric, not thinking too far ahead, just the next stitch, and the one after that. She pulled the edges together as cleanly as the wound's irregular shape allowed, and he didn't make a sound. He breathed. She could feel him breathe in the slight rise and fall of his leg under her hands, and occasionally he'd tighten on the chair back hard enough to make the wood creak. 12 stitches. She tied off the last one and sat back and looked at what she'd done. It wasn't beautiful. The edges were even enough and the tension was correct, but it would scar badly, which it would have done regardless, and the scar would sit over a leg that already carried the old damage in the knee. 2 old injuries and 1 new one on the same man, both legs now marked by things that hadn't broken him. "It's done," she said. He looked down at it. He took a long breath through his nose and let it out slowly. "Thank you," he said. His voice was different. Not softer exactly, but the layer had changed. Something close to the surface in a way he didn't usually allow. She wrapped the wound tightly in clean strips, firm enough to hold pressure, loose enough not to restrict what needed to keep moving. Then she stood up, and her legs were unsteady in a way she hadn't permitted herself to notice until now, and she put one hand on the table and breathed for a moment quietly until the unsteadiness passed. "You need to get to the cot," she said. "I'm fine in the chair. The chair is not where you sleep when you have a wound like that. You need to be flat and warm." She looked at him. "Don't argue with me about this." Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of amusement, visible even through the exhaustion and the aftermath of pain. "You're different," he said. "Different from what?" "From when I found you." She picked up the bloody rags and the whiskey bottle. "You found me half frozen in the snow," she said. "Most things would be different from that." "That's not what I mean." She stopped and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a category for yet. Direct and present, and more open than he usually allowed himself to be. "You were frightened before," he said. "Not anymore." She thought about it, honestly. "I don't have time to be frightened right now." "No," he said. "That's not it either." She didn't know what to say to that. So she went back to him and got his arm over her shoulders and walked him to the cot, and her hips screamed its full opinion about his weight, and she told it she'd sit down soon. They got him down onto the cot with an awkward, controlled effort that got the job done without either of them falling. She covered him with the 2 heaviest furs and put a careful amount of wood on the fire to hold through the night. Then she pulled the other chair to the side of the cot and sat in it. "I'll stay up for a while," she said, "in case the fever starts. You don't need to, Garrett." She said his name the way you say stop. "Let me." He looked at the ceiling. She could see him working through the particular difficulty of a self-sufficient man, accepting that tonight he was not self-sufficient. The jaw muscle moved. Something behind his eyes did the same. "All right," he said. She sat back in the chair. The fire burned. Outside, the blizzard pressed itself against the cabin walls with the sound of sustained fury, and somewhere in the trees a branch came down with a crack she felt in her sternum. Inside, the fire held. Flint climbed onto the cot, something she had never seen him do before, and curled at Garrett's feet with the heaviness of a dog that had made a decision and intended to keep it. Garrett's breathing slowed and evened as exhaustion overtook the pain. Nell sat in the chair and watched the fire, and thought about what he'd said. "You were frightened before. Not anymore." She hadn't realized it herself until he named it. She tried to locate the frightened person she'd been in the snow and found she could remember her clearly. Could remember the cold and the despair and the absolute helpless smallness of it. But that person felt oddly distant now, like someone she'd heard about rather than been. She thought about what had changed. It wasn't that the danger was less. The wound on Garrett's leg told its own story about the nature of danger in this place. It wasn't that she was stronger in any single physical sense, though her hands were rougher now, and her arms had something in them they hadn't had before. It was something else. It had to do with having been useful, really useful, in a way that mattered, in a way that was entirely her own. The meals that had kept 2 people fed, the clothing she'd mended that kept them warm, the stitches she'd just put in a man's leg that would, she believed, hold. Being needed was not the same thing as being loved. She knew the difference, had spent enough of her life confusing the two, But it was something. It was a version of mattering that didn't depend on anyone's approval or anyone's kindness or anyone's decision to keep you around. You could keep yourself around. You could be the reason you were still there. That, she thought, was what had changed. She added one small piece of wood to the fire and banked it carefully, and she settled back into the chair. And the night was very long and very loud, and she was awake for most of both. But she was awake in the way of someone keeping watch, not in the way of someone afraid of the dark. There was a difference, she had learned. A significant one. The fever came on the second day. She'd been watching for it, checking his forehead every few hours the way her mother used to check bread dough, pressing the back of her hand to his skin and reading what was there. The first morning after the injury it was normal, or close enough that she let herself think they might have gotten lucky. By the second evening his skin was dry and hot in a way that wasn't good. By the middle of that night he was sweating through the furs, and his breathing had changed from the deep regular sleep of exhaustion into something shallower and more effortful. She kept cold compresses on his forehead through the night, rinsing the cloth in the tin basin, wringing it out, pressing it back. It was tedious work and probably only partially effective, and she did it anyway because it was the thing she could do. She changed the bandage on the leg every morning. The wound looked as it should. Angry and swollen, but no red lines spreading outward from the edges. No smell that would mean infection had taken hold in the way that killed people out here without any recourse. The stitches were holding. That was the most important thing. Everything else, the fever, the food situation, the cold pressing through the cabin walls, was secondary to that single fact. She came back to it the way you come back to a fixed point when everything else is moving. The stitches were holding. Garrett was not a good patient. She would not have expected him to be. In the first full day of fever, he was mostly under, sleeping heavily, surfacing occasionally into a half-consciousness that wasn't really wakefulness, saying things that were fragments she couldn't assemble. A name once, or she thought it was a name, too blurred to catch. Something about a river, something about weather. She didn't try to respond to any of it. She kept the cloth cold and the fire steady and the leg elevated on a folded fur and waited for his body to do what bodies did when given the right conditions. On the second day of fever, he was awake more, which was better and worse simultaneously. Better because it meant the fever wasn't taking him under. Worse because a semi-conscious Garrett Voss was still mostly Garrett Voss, and Garrett Voss did not like lying on his back being tended to. "I need to check the north line," he said. The first coherent thing he said that second morning. She was at the stove. She turned and looked at him. "No, there's a beaver set up there, that Garrett." She kept her voice even. "You have a wound I stitched closed 40 hours ago. You have a fever. You're not going anywhere." He looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man revising his next argument. "The traps need running," he said. "The traps will keep. The animals won't. If something's caught and it sits too long in this cold, then it sits." She brought a cup of water to the side of the cot and held it out. "Drink this." He looked at the cup. He looked at her. He drank the water with the particular energy of a man doing something under protest and wanting that known. "You're stubborn," he said. "Learned it from someone," she said. He was quiet. She thought he almost smiled. The fever broke on the third day the way fevers do. Suddenly and messily, with a night of heavy sweating that soaked through everything and left him pale and wrung out in the morning, but with clear eyes for the first time since the branch had taken him down. She changed the bedding and the bandage and made broth from the last of the dried venison, thin and not particularly good, and he drank all of it without complaint. "How much meat do we have left?" he said. "Not much." "How much?" She'd been waiting for this conversation. "Enough for maybe 10 days if I'm careful. Less if the cold stays this hard and we need to eat more to keep warm." He was quiet, working through the same arithmetic she'd already worked through. His face did the calculating thing, slow and thorough. "I need to get back on the lines," he said. "Your leg. I know what my leg is. How long until I can walk on it properly?" She thought about the wound honestly, the way she'd learned to think about the hip, without wishing and without pretending. 2 weeks before you should put full weight on it. 10 days minimum before you try anything beyond the cabin. He looked at the ceiling. "We don't have 2 weeks of food," he said. "I know that." She sat down in the chair beside the cot. "I've already thought about it. And there's a snare in the draw northeast of the cabin. 50 yards or so. Simple trigger. You showed me how to reset one in November when we were talking about the lines. I can check it. I can reset it. I can't run your full trap line, and I'm not going to pretend I can. But I can manage the near sets while your leg heals enough to take weight." He was quiet for a long moment. "The draw runs along the base of the larger of the two spruce," he said finally. "The run is consistent. Rabbits use it morning and evening. Reset the trigger sensitive, not tight." "I understand sensitive versus tight," she said. "You explained the difference." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, that slight revision he did when she demonstrated a competence he hadn't fully accounted for. "There's dried fish in the flat tin under the second shelf," he said. "I forgot about it. Not much, but it's there." She found it immediately, because she'd inventoried every shelf in the cabin twice by this point and had simply not known what was in that particular tin. 6 pieces of dried fish, hard and dark, smelling powerfully of themselves. Not much, but she recalculated their food situation upward by 5 days and felt the relief of it move through her physically. "That helps," she said. He let out a slow breath. Then he said her name, which he did rarely enough that she noticed every time. Nell. She looked at him. I'm not going to tell you what to do if something happens to me, he said. You already know what you'd need to do. Nothing is going to happen to you. That's not what I know what you're saying. She set the tin down on the table, and I'm choosing not to have that conversation today. Today you have a fever that broke this morning and you need to eat and rest, and I'm going to check the snare, and we're going to deal with what is actually in front of us right now instead of the worst version of what might be. He looked at her for a long moment. Fine, he said. Good. She went to the snare that afternoon in a break between snowfalls, when the visibility was decent enough to navigate by landmarks. She found the draw where he'd described it, and the snare where he'd said it would be. Empty but undisturbed, the trigger intact. She reset it with the adjustment he'd specified and found 2 more nearby that she'd nearly missed, barely visible under a thin coat of new snow, and reset those as well. She came back to the cabin cold and tired and with nothing to show for it, and he was awake on the cot and looked at her when she came in with the same question she had in herself. Empty, she said, but I reset them. He nodded once. She took off her outer coat and went to the stove and started water heating. She didn't say anything further, and neither did he. Some silences were their own kind of answer. The snare was empty for 3 days. She checked it every morning, and every morning she came back with nothing and revised the food situation quietly in her head and kept it to herself because worry was only useful when it produced action, and she was already taking every action available to her. On the 4th day she found a rabbit. She stood in the cold draw for a moment looking at it before she did anything else. It was not a large rabbit. It was a perfectly ordinary rabbit that had made the mistake of using the wrong path on the wrong morning. She felt the specific weight of what it meant, and then she reset the snare and came back to the cabin and held it up when she came through the door. Garrett was sitting up on the cot, which was the furthest he'd managed since the injury. He looked at the rabbit, then at her. The draw is good, she said. The reset is working. He nodded once. They had rabbit for dinner that evening, and it was the best meal she'd made in 2 weeks, and not only because of the quality of the ingredients. Garrett was healing, or healing as much as Garrett was going to allow himself to heal, which meant that by the 5th day after the fever broke, he was upright and moving around the cabin despite everything she said about it. The leg held his weight with what she could see was significant pain, but it held. And when she changed the bandage that morning, the wound was closing in the way she'd hoped, the edges knitting together with a steadiness that meant the stitching had done its job. It's going to be a bad scar, she said. I have others, he said. She'd noticed. She didn't comment. The stitching is good, he said. He said it to the ceiling in the tone of someone reporting a factual observation. It's functional, she said. It's not pretty. Doesn't need to be pretty, he said. She finished wrapping it and sat back. How's the pain? Manageable. Which meant considerable. She'd learned his scale. I'm going to check the snare, she said. I'll come. She looked at him. You know the area, he said. But if we need to move the set, I can read the signs faster. He met her gaze steadily. That's not a criticism. It's just true. She wanted to argue and recognize that he was right, and being right made arguing harder. You use the staff, she said, the branch she'd cut and smoothed for him while he was down. Fine. They went out together, which was the first time she'd been outside with him since the night he'd come through the door. The cold was still extraordinary, the kind that had weight to it, almost a physical presence you moved through rather than simply felt. The snow was deep and crusted from a freeze-thaw cycle that had left the surface just strong enough to suggest it would hold your weight, and just weak enough to be wrong about half the time. Garrett moved slowly but steadily, the staff taking the weight his leg couldn't. She matched his pace, which was easier than her own would have been. Her hip liked even surfaces, which described nothing about deep-crusted snow. The draw was empty again. She watched him crouch carefully, favoring the leg, and examine the snow around the snare with the concentrated attention he gave to things he was reading rather than merely looking at. He touched the snow in 2 places, checked the trigger, studied the surrounding trees. Move it, he said. 10 feet north. There's a run here. He pointed and she looked and saw nothing immediately, and then she saw it, the snow along the base of a fallen log barely disturbed in a way that was different from wind disturbance, a subtle regularity that meant repeated passage. I didn't see that, she said. It's subtle, he said. They're moving at night when it's coldest. He straightened slowly. Move it there. Keep the trigger sensitive. She did it while he watched, and he said nothing, which she understood to mean she was doing it correctly. They were heading back when Flint stopped. Not the casual pause of scenting something interesting. The full rigid stillness of an animal that had identified a specific threat, head up, gaze fixed on the western tree line, a low sound beginning in his chest. She stopped. Garrett stopped. How far back is the rifle, he said quietly. On the porch, she said. Same quiet register. They heard them before they saw them, the short high vocalizations moving through the trees from more than one direction. Walk back, Garrett said. Don't run. I know. They turned and walked, the deliberate, unhurried pace of people who understood that running invited pursuit and that the cabin was the only destination. She moved slightly closer to his left side, without making a production of it, compensating for the leg without announcing that she was. She saw the first wolf at the tree line, gray and thin, watching them with the patient focus of an animal that had been following them for longer than they'd known. There were 3 more visible, likely more she couldn't see. "Flint," Garrett said, his voice flat and low. The dog came immediately to his heel. The cabin porch was 30 yards away. 20. The wolves came to the edge of the trees and held there, which wasn't reassuring. It meant they were close enough to calculate 15 yards. The lead wolf moved, not a full commitment, a testing movement, angling toward Garrett's right side where the staff and the altered gait made him look like the more viable target. She saw it happen and turned toward it and shouted, not words, just sound, loud and sharp and as large as she could make herself. And the wolf checked, startled, pulled back 2 steps, 10 yards to the porch. She got there first and had the rifle off the wall and back through the door in under 10 seconds. And Garrett came through with Flint at his heels and she put her shoulder against the door and they got it closed. They both stood there. Her heart was going very fast. She was aware of this the way you're aware of weather, as a fact occurring in your vicinity. You shouted at it, Garrett said. It worked, she said. It worked, he agreed. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of respect, which didn't look like other people's versions but was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. She was already at the window lifting the corner of the oilcloth. 5 wolves at the edge of the clearing, all of them with the same gaunt, angular look of animals that had been moving through bad country in a bad winter. "They'll come back," she said, "yes, tonight, or they'll wait and watch. We ended this before," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "In the morning," he said. "First light, better visibility." "All right." She let the oilcloth fall. The cabin was very small around them, both of them standing near the window in the low firelight, close enough that she was aware of the cold still coming off his coat from the time they'd been outside. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "For going down, for putting us in this position." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without softening. But there was something underneath it that cost him more than the words suggested. "You didn't plan to get hit by a falling branch," she said. "I should have been watching better." The weather was Garrett. She turned toward him. "You carried me out of a blizzard. You fed me and kept me alive and didn't ask for anything in return. You don't get to apologize for getting hurt." He looked at her steadily. The firelight moved across his face and she could see the exhaustion in it and the pain from the leg and the particular heaviness of a man who had been alone so long that being in someone's debt was a weight he didn't know the shape of. "You stitched me back together," he said. "Yes." "You sat up 3 nights." "Yes." "Why?" The question seemed entirely genuine, which made it one of the strangest questions she'd been asked in a long time. She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you're still alive," she said, "and I'd like you to stay that way." He didn't say anything. She went back to the stove and put water on and kept her attention on that for a moment. In the morning, Garrett took the lead wolf with a single shot from the window, and the others broke and were gone before the echo finished returning from the mountains. What remained in the clearing was the specific weight of what necessity sometimes asks of you, and neither of them tried to make it lighter than it was. They went out together and did what needed doing, and that evening she cooked what she could from the animal and set the rest to freeze on the porch. The meat was lean and strong and not particularly pleasant, and they ate it without complaint because it was the difference between the numbers working and not working. The crisis passed. The winter didn't. But what was left behind the crisis was different from what had been there before it, and she felt the difference in the evenings now when she looked across the cabin at him. Something had settled between them that hadn't been there in December. Not comfortable exactly, because neither of them was built for comfortable, but solid. The way good stitching is solid, not beautiful, but holding. Spring didn't arrive the way people who hadn't wintered in the mountains might imagine. It didn't come as a morning when the world was suddenly soft and forgiving. It came in arguments, a warm afternoon followed by 2 days of hard freeze. A week of melt that softened the snow to slush, and then an overnight cold that turned the slush to ice and made the porch steps genuinely dangerous. It came in the sound of water moving under the snowpack before any water was visible. It came in the way the light changed, almost imperceptibly at first, just a quality to the afternoon sun that was different from January's thin gray. Something with more intention in it. Nell noticed it first in Flint. The dog started spending more time at the door, not in the watchful way of deep winter, but with a restlessness that was pointed outward. He wanted to range. She understood the feeling. The 4 walls of the cabin, however necessary, had been pressing in since February. She'd always been someone who needed to move to see what was around the next thing. Stillness had never agreed with her. She'd managed it because she'd had to, but the walls knew it, and she knew they knew. What filled the late winter and early spring was a different kind of work. Longer horizon work, planning work. Garrett had begun preparing his season's pelts for sale, and she'd taken on the task of maintaining his records, which lived in a battered ledger on the highest shelf. His records were functional but disorganized, the notation system of a man keeping accounts only for himself. She reorganized them without being asked and explained the new system to him once. "That's better," he said, and went back to work. She also began a proper inventory of what the cabin needed. Not the survival inventory of the first weeks, but a longer-term assessment. The chinking between the north-facing logs had deteriorated and needed redoing before next winter. The second porch step from the top had been softening since before she'd arrived and would become genuinely dangerous in the thaw. The woodpile would need restocking early in spring. The single oilcloth window let in too little light and too much cold around its edges. She wrote it all down in the margins of paper she found in the back of the ledger. She did not show it to Garrett. She told herself she was doing it out of habit, the habit of a person who managed things by understanding them fully. She didn't examine that reasoning too carefully. The conversation she'd been not having with herself all winter became harder to avoid in March, when the melt started in earnest and the world beyond the cabin began to reappear. The creek she'd been able to hear but not see all winter became visible again, dark water at the edges of ice and then a proper running current, cold and fast with snowmelt. The mountains above the tree line showed themselves fully for the first time. She'd known abstractly that they were there, but now she could see them, white and enormous against a sky that was beginning to hold actual blue some afternoons. The pass would open, not for weeks yet probably, but it would open, and when it opened she had an arrangement to honor. In spring you leave. She hadn't forgotten it. She'd placed it in a part of her mind she wasn't visiting regularly, the way you don't enter a room where something uncomfortable is stored. But March brought it back with the same reliability it brought back the creek and the mountain view. Things that had been there all along, just temporarily covered. She was awake early on a morning in late March, sitting at the table with both hands around a cup of coffee, the real coffee that Garrett had produced from a small tin she hadn't known about sometime in February, appearing one morning with an expression as close to conspiratorial as his face was capable of getting. She was thinking not particularly productively about what came next. She had no home to return to, no family, not in any functional sense, no money, no property, no particular destination. She'd come through that pass with a family who hadn't wanted her, and she'd survived the winter with a man who very much hadn't wanted her originally and had nevertheless kept her alive and worked beside her and said, "I believe you," at a moment when those two words had meant more than most longer things she'd been told. And in spring, she was supposed to simply choose a direction and walk in it. She was still sitting with this when Garrett came in from checking the morning. He came to the stove and poured coffee, and then, instead of going to his chair or to the work table, he stayed standing at the stove with his back to her for a longer time than usual. She waited. "There's going to be a wagon train through," he said eventually, to the wall above the stove. "Month and a half, maybe 2 months. They come through the lower pass in late May most years. I go down to trade the season's pelts. There's a trading post at the junction." "All right," she said. "You could join them." He turned slightly, not facing her but no longer fully turned away. "I have gold set aside from good years," he said. "You could take enough to get yourself established somewhere. Portland's grown considerably, Sacramento, somewhere with more than this." She looked at him. She could see in the careful evenness of how he was standing that he had been preparing this for a while. The plan, the gold, the sensible transition, the way you prepare something for someone when you've decided their well-being matters to you more than your preference for the outcome. "How much gold?" she said. Something shifted in his jaw. "Enough. That's not an amount. Enough to start over comfortably." He finally turned and looked at her. "You deserve a better situation than this. A real house. A town. People." She looked down at her cup. She thought about Portland. She thought about Sacramento. She tried to picture herself arriving somewhere with enough gold to be respectable, starting over, building whatever came next in a place with proper buildings and other people and seasons that didn't try to kill you. The picture didn't take hold the way she'd expected it to. "Do you want me to go?" she said. "I want." He started, stopped. "What I want isn't the relevant question. It's one of them." He was quiet. She put her cup down and looked at him directly in the way she'd learned he was capable of tolerating, which was more directly than most people expected from her. "Garrett, do you want me to go?" The silence that followed was the third kind, the one she'd started to recognize in the evenings, the one that felt like presence more than absence. A log shifted in the fire. Flint raised his head from the floor and then lowered it again. "No," Garrett said. He said it the way he said things that were true and that he'd argued with himself about before saying them. "No, I don't want you to go. But what I want doesn't stop saying that." She stood up from the table, not dramatically, just stood because she needed to be standing for this. "I have spent my entire life around people who told me that what they needed mattered more than what I was worth. My stepmother decided I was a liability and my father decided she was right. And I heard them plan it, and I climbed into that wagon every morning anyway because I didn't know what else to do, and I thought that was what love required of me." Her voice stayed even. She'd made peace with the fact of it, though not yet entirely with the feeling. "I'm not doing that again," she said. "I'm not letting someone else decide where I belong. So I'm asking you directly, do you want me to stay? Yes. Then say so. Don't pack my bag and hand me gold and make the decision for me because you've decided you're not worth staying for." That landed. She could see it land. A small tightening around his eyes, a fractional shift in how he was standing, the particular stillness of a man who has been handed a true thing and is holding it carefully because he isn't sure yet of its weight. She hadn't meant it as a weapon, she'd meant it as true, and it was true, and she wasn't going to unsay it. "It's not a small thing," he said. "Staying here, it's a hard life, it doesn't get easier. I know that, I've been living it for 4 months. A hard life gets harder," he said when. He stopped. "When what?" He looked at her with the expression she'd seen a handful of times, the one that appeared when he'd come as close to the surface of himself as he usually allowed and found himself there without quite knowing how to proceed. "When you care whether someone's all right," he said, "it gets harder when that's part of it." She understood what that sentence had cost him. She didn't treat it cheaply. She let it sit in the air between them for a moment. "I know," she said more quietly. "I know it does." He looked at her for a long time. He looked at the window where morning light was coming through the oilcloth, pale gold and growing. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "The chinking on the north wall needs redoing," he said. She blinked. "I have it on a list," she said. "And the step, second from the top. I've known about that since February. I was thinking," he said slowly. The way he said things he was working out as he said them. "We could add another room. Not large. The back wall is sound and there's timber available if I start cutting in April. More space would help." She looked at this man with his scarred neck and his rebuilt knee and his 11 years of deliberate solitude and his complete inability to say directly any of the things he actually meant, and she felt something move through her chest that she didn't try to name or manage. She just let it be there. "It would help," she agreed. "We should also think about a proper root cellar before next fall. The cold storage situation is manageable, but it's not good. There's a spot on the east side where the ground isn't too rocky. I'll add it to the list," he said. He took his coffee to the table and sat down. She sat across from him. They drank their coffee in the quiet that had never really been silence, not since the creek started running again. And outside the morning was doing something particular with the light on the high peaks, turning the remaining snow toward gold. She thought about April. About timber cutting and chinking, and a room that didn't exist yet. She thought about that, and found she was already looking forward to it. 4 weeks later, in a break of good weather that came in the second week of April, Corden Whitmore appeared at the edge of the clearing. Nell saw him before he reached the cabin. She was on the porch checking the woodpile, calculating what they had against what spring cutting needed to produce, and she looked up at the sound of footsteps in the softening snow and saw him standing at the tree line about 40 yards out. He looked older than she remembered. Not old, but aged in the particular way that a winter of carrying something heavy ages a person. He was alone. No Harriet, no Birch or Ledger. Just her father standing at the edge of the shadows with his hat in his hands, which he had always done when he was uncertain of his welcome somewhere, a habit she'd known since childhood and had never expected to see directed at her. She stood still for a moment. Then she walked down the porch steps and crossed the clearing toward him and stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She could see him taking in the fact of her, the solidity of her, the way she was standing in the snow in good boots with her weight distributed carefully and her hands at her sides and no particular urgency in any part of her posture. She had learned over the course of this winter how to occupy the ground she was standing on, how to stand as though the ground itself had agreed to hold her. He said, "You look well." She said, "You look like you've been carrying something heavy." He nodded, a single slow movement, the way he nodded when he had no argument to make. "I went back for you," he said, "the morning after. I went back." She waited. "The storm had covered everything," he said. "Your tracks, the camp, the tree line. I couldn't find the place where you'd gone in for wood. I looked for 3 hours." He paused. "I thought you'd died in it." She held this without saying anything. He continued. "I thought I had let her convince me and I had gone and come back and you were dead. And I have spent this entire winter with that, every day since November." She believed him. That was the complicated part. She believed that he had gone back, and she believed that he had spent the winter with it, and she believed that he was standing here now because he was her father, and he had loved her, and that love, imperfect and insufficient as it had turned out to be, was real. None of that changed what the tracks in the snow had shown her. "You knew," she said. She said it without accusation, just as a statement of what had happened. You heard her plan it, and you didn't say no. You said you would think about it, and then you thought about it, and you let it happen. He didn't look away. She'd half expected him to, the way he'd always gone quiet when things were difficult, but he held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I'm not going to tell you that's alt-right," she said, "because it's not. And I'm not going to tell you I don't believe you love me, because I do believe it, and that's the part I've had to figure out how to carry. That both things are true at the same time. That you love me and you let her put me in the snow. I've spent 4 months learning to carry both of those things together, and I've managed it, but I didn't manage it for you. I managed it for myself." He was quiet for a long time. The creek was running somewhere below them, and the birds that had begun returning to the timber were moving in the branches above, and somewhere behind her she was aware of the cabin, of Flint probably at the window by now, of Garrett probably having stopped whatever he was doing. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me," Corden said. "Good," she said, "because I'm not ready to have that conversation, and I don't know if I ever will be, and I don't want to say something I don't mean." He nodded again. He looked at his hat. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Really?" She thought about the honest answer to that question. She thought about the hip and the wolves and the 12 stitches and the rabbit snare and the root cellars she was going to dig before next fall and the room that wasn't built yet and the window that was going to have real glass in it. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." More than that, actually. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw something move through his expression that she thought was grief and relief in equal measure. The particular combination of a man who has been carrying the weight of a loss that turned out not to be final. "I'll go," he said. "I know." He put his hat back on. He looked at her one more time, the way you look at something you are trying to memorize, and then he turned and walked back into the trees, and she watched him go until he was gone. She stood in the clearing for a moment after. She was waiting to see what she felt. She had expected grief or anger or relief or some combination of them in some proportion. What she found instead was something quieter and cleaner than any of those. A kind of settling. The way a house settles when the foundation is finally level. She had said what was true. He had heard it. No one had pretended. That was the most honest exchange she'd had with a member of her family in her entire life, and it had happened in 20 minutes in a clearing in Washington Territory with the creek running and the birds coming back to the timber, and it was enough. Not everything, but enough. She walked back to the cabin and went up the porch steps. Garrett was at the table. He hadn't pretended to be doing something else. He was simply sitting there, which she appreciated, the way she'd come to appreciate all his particular varieties of directness. She sat down across from him. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. She poured coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup, and they sat together in the quiet that had never been empty. Not once, not from the beginning, though it had taken her a while to understand that. After a while, she said, "I want to start the root cellar this week, before the ground softens too much on the surface and not enough underneath." He said, "The east side. You're right about the ground there." She nodded. "And we need to talk about the window. The glass isn't cheap, but the oilcloth is losing its efficiency. If we're doing the north wall chinking and the step in the new room, we might as well do it right." He looked at her across the table. "We'll go down with the pelts when the train comes through," he said. "You can price the glass yourself." She thought about that. About standing at a trading post counter and negotiating for a pane of glass that would let real light into a cabin that was hers in all the ways that mattered. "All right," she said. The wagon train came through on a warm morning in the third week of May, moving through the valley below the cabin in a long line of canvas-covered wagons, their pace unhurried in the spring air. Nell and Garrett went down the following day with the season's pelts loaded on the sled and the mule that lived in the shelter a quarter-mile from the cabin, an animal she'd learned about incrementally over the course of the winter, one of many things about this place still revealing itself to her. The trading post was crowded with the train's traffic. The smell of it hit her when she came through the door, unwashed people and tobacco and fresh-cut lumber and something sweet she couldn't identify, and the noise and the density of it was overwhelming for about 20 minutes, and then she found her footing. She negotiated the price of the pelts herself. The trader's initial offer was low by about 20%, which she knew because she'd been keeping Garrett's records for 5 months and had a clear sense of what the season's take was worth. She said so, calmly and specifically, with numbers. The trader looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating, and then he looked at Garrett, who was standing slightly behind her, and to the left with an expression of complete neutrality. Garrett said nothing. The trader came up 15%. She got the last 5 by pointing out the quality differential in the beaver pelts, which was genuinely exceptional, and the trader, to his credit, acknowledged it. She chose her boots herself, good leather, well-constructed, sized right, which the previous pair had never been. She paid what they were worth without bargaining because they were worth it. She bought the glass last. It was expensive, a proper pane sized for the window, and she held it carefully on the walk back to the sled and thought about the light that would come through it in the mornings, real and clear, the way light should come through a window. As she was loading the last of it, a woman from the wagon train came to stand nearby. Maybe 45, trail-weathered, with the look of someone who had been moving for months and had made her peace with it. "You're not with the train," the woman said. "No," Nell said. "I live up the mountain." The woman glanced toward Garrett at the sled, then back. "Been there long?" "Since November." "Through the whole winter?" The woman's voice held a particular quality, the tone of someone assessing another person's situation and deciding whether to comment on it. "Yes." A pause. "Alone?" "Not alone," Nell said. The woman looked at her for a moment with the evaluating look of someone who was wondering about the shape of things and whether to ask further. "It's a hard country," the woman said finally. "It is," Nell agreed. Then she said the thing she hadn't planned to say, that came out with the simple certain something of something she'd known without knowing she knew it. "It's also mine." She stood with that for a moment after it left her mouth, testing it against what was true. It was true. The mountain and the timber and the cold and the quality of the air up there. The creek she could hear from the porch, and the peaks that went red in March, and the snare in the draw, and the cabin with its rough walls and its fire that she kept, and the list of things that needed doing that she was already looking forward to doing. It was hers because she had nearly died for it and chosen to stay anyway, because nothing is truly yours until you've paid for it in something real. The woman nodded as if she understood this and moved back toward her wagon. Garrett appeared at Nell's shoulder. He'd heard the last part, she thought. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." They loaded the last of it and turned the mule back toward the mountain. The ride up was long, and she let herself be tired from the noise of the trading post, swaying with the motion of the sled, watching the valley fall away behind them and the timber close back in on either side. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the mountains above, turning the snow on the high peaks between pink and gold. She'd noticed this light all winter, but there had been no one to mention it to, or it hadn't seemed worth mentioning until now. "The light on those peaks," she said. Garrett looked. He held on it for a moment. "March is better," he said. "Sometimes when the clouds are a certain way, it goes red, real red. You'll see it." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, not at her. He had said it the way you mention a seasonal thing to someone who will be there for the season. The way you share the calendar of a place with someone who belongs to it. Not an invitation, a fact. The kind of fact you only state when you've already accepted it as settled. She turned forward again. "I want a garden," she said, "the south side of the cabin. The afternoon sun is good there. We could have vegetables by midsummer if I start breaking ground now." "Ground is hard up there," he said. "I know. I'll work it in sections." A pause. "I'll help," he said. She nodded. "You can help," she said. The cabin came into view through the trees as the light was going. The stone chimney first, and then the walls, the framed addition open to the sky and waiting on its roof. Flint was on the porch, having preceded them back by a considerable margin, watching their approach with his yellow eyes, and the particular stillness that meant he had already decided everything was acceptable, and was simply waiting for them to arrive at the same conclusion. She got down from the sled and her new boots hit the ground solidly. The bad hip registered the long day, and she acknowledged it and told it she was almost done. She stood and looked at the cabin, rough and small and in need of significant work in more places than she'd listed. Not the cabin of a person who'd ever had enough help or enough time. The cabin of a man who had been alone for 11 years and had survived it, and had built something that was solid in its bones even where it was rough at the edges, and who had walked 2 miles through a blizzard in November to find a woman he didn't know because he had decided he was not going to be the man who waited again. Her family had run their numbers in November and decided the math didn't work. They hadn't been entirely wrong about the math. What they'd miscalculated was the variable, what she was capable of becoming when the weight of the calculation was finally lifted from her back. You didn't find that out in a wagon headed somewhere you hadn't chosen. You found it out in the particular conditions of being left with nothing and having to build anyway. You found out that you could stitch a wound in a man's leg with your hands unsteady and get it right. That you could step between a wolf and a door and make a sound large enough to make it hesitate. That you could manage a snare and stretch a supply of dried meat longer than it wanted to go and keep a fire burning through the worst nights of a mountain winter and negotiate the price of a season's worth of pelts and carry the complicated truth of your father's love and your father's failure at the same time, in the same chest, without letting either one of them finish you. Being discarded didn't define you. How you built after it did. She wasn't grateful for what her family had done. She wasn't going to perform gratitude for pain that had been real and had cost her real things. But she was standing on a mountain in spring boots with a list of improvements for a cabin that was hers in all the ways that mattered, next to a man who had said yes when it counted, and she was going to break ground on a garden tomorrow morning and see what the soil had to offer. Garrett had unhitched the mule and was carrying the first load toward the cabin. He paused in the doorway and looked back at her, still standing in the clearing. "Coming in?" he said. "In a minute." He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at things he was trying to understand, not impatiently, just fully. Then he went inside and left her to her minute, because that was what he did. And she had long since understood that it was one of the most important things about him. He gave people their minute. He didn't fill it with himself. She stood in the clearing in the last light and let it be everything it was. Cold still in the shadows of the trees, the creek running clean and constant somewhere below. The mountains holding their last color above the timber, that particular gold that only existed for about 20 minutes around this time in the late afternoon of early spring. Flint came down from the porch and leaned against her leg, which he had started doing sometime in February, and she put her hand on his broad gray head and they stood there together for a moment without needing it to be anything more than what it was. Then she turned and walked inside and pulled the door shut behind her, and the fire was going, and the coffee was on, and Garrett was at the table, and she sat down and pulled out the list of what came next and began to read it over. The root cellar, the chinking on the north wall, the second porch step. The new room, the garden on the south side, the window that would let real light in. There was a great deal on it. She picked up her pen and added one more item at the bottom. See the red in March. Then she set the pen down and looked at the fire and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and unhurried pleasure of having somewhere to be. Not somewhere she had been pointed toward by someone else's hand. Not somewhere she had drifted into out of necessity or lack of options. Somewhere she had chosen, with her eyes open and her hands steadied and the full knowledge of what it cost and what it gave back. Outside, the last of the light left the peaks and the mountain went quiet with the particular quiet of a place that has seen many winters and expects to see many more and finds nothing remarkable about one more woman deciding to stay. Inside, the fire held. She was still alive. More than that, actually.